Now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Martin Thierry, our librarian at the Museum of Freemasonry. And Martin will give us a talk about frontispieces from the Books of Constitutions. We are very excited to hear more, Martin. Over to you.
Hi. Right. In 1723, the Grand Lodge in London published its first rule book, or constitutions, an important step by the Grand Lodge seek to impose itself on the expanding Masonic world. The significance attached to the publication of its constitutions is evidenced by the inclusion of an engraved frontispiece, which raised both the price and the status of the book. In a period when books were sold unbound, frontispieces illustrating the theme of the book or a portrait of the author were often sold separately, to be added when the owner got their book bound. A frontispiece acts in a similar way to the cover illustration of a modern book. Between 1723 and 1819, two rival Grand Lodges of England and the United Grand Lodge of England published 15 books of constitutions, for which 6 frontispieces were created. This talk explains how the frontispieces were used to convey messages about the nature of Freemasonry and its position in society. It examines how the illustrations could be used as a propaganda tool for the rivalry between the two Grand Lodges, highlights the artists behind them, and how their work inspired others. The Constitutions of the Freemasons, published for the first Grand Lodge of England in 1723, was the work of a Presbyterian priest called James Anderson, and the scientific publishers Senex and Hooke. Very little of the book is taken up with rules and regulations. It's dominated by a history of Freemasonry derived from stonemasons' legends, culled from manuscripts dating back to the 14th century called Old Charges, and Anderson's imagination. It concludes with a collection of bawdy Masonic songs. Regulations that appeared in those manuscript Old Charges were also digested by Anderson and used to form a moral framework for Freemasonry, which is still in use today. With the aid of a symbolic frontispiece by the engraver John Pine, the book established the Grand Lodge as the governing body of English Freemasonry. It also helped to spread Freemasonry around the globe. Irish and Dutch editions were published in 1730. The first American edition was published by Ben Franklin in Philadelphia in 1734, and French and German language editions appeared in 1736 and 1738. However, this talk is going to concentrate on the English editions and its artists and engravers, starting with John Pine. Pine was an enthusiastic Freemason, belonging to lodges meeting at the Globe in Moorgate and the Horn Tavern in Westminster. At the time of publication, Pine was at the start of an illustrious career as an engraver, which would put him in the same circle of Freemason artists such as James Thornhill, who painted the ceiling frescoes in St Paul's Cathedral, and Thornhill's son-in-law, William Hogarth, who engraved this portrait of Pine on the left. Between 1722 and 1741, Pine was responsible for the engraved list of lodges, pocket guides to the meeting times and venues of lodges under the new Grand Lodge of England. Although Pine is recorded as the engraver of the frontispiece of the 17 constitutions, there is doubt that it was his design. Several commentators, including our original Grand Lodge librarian Henry Sadler in 1901, and Professor Andrew Prescott in 2008, suggested it may have been designed by Sir James Thornhill, who designed the frontispiece to Pine's engraved list, which you can see in the centre of this slide. Pine's frontispiece for the 1723 constitutions depicts John, the second Duke of Montague, the Grand Lodge's first noble Grand Master, handing over a manuscript copy of the constitutions and a set of compasses to his successor, Philip, Duke of Wharton. They're accompanied by their deputies and wardens. One, on the far left of the picture, carries leather aprons and gloves, an early depiction of the working clothes of stonemasons appearing in a Masonic setting. On the far right is a priest, who is probably the Reverend John Desaguliers, who was Wharton's deputy, and one of the driving forces behind English Freemasonry in the early 18th century. Pine places the scene within a classical arcade, depicting the 5 orders of architecture, in order of antiquity from Tuscan at the back through to composite at the front, showing that although Freemasonry is rooted in antiquity, it's forward-looking and progressive. There are other references to antiquity to look out for. Through the arch at the back, Pine depicts the parting of the Red Sea, tracing Freemasonry back to biblical times, as Anderson did in his legendary history. Flying above the arch in his chariot is the sun god Helios, who's often used by artists to represent education, science, and understanding. The strange little diagram sitting between the two men at the front represents Euclid's 47th proposition, or Pythagoras' theorem, essential in construction for squaring structures. Anderson called it the foundation of all masonry, sacred, civil, and military. After Pine's depiction, it became a common symbol in Masonic art, from floor cloths to Masonic jewels. Taken as a whole, Pine's frontispiece could represent progress, embodied by the new Grand Lodge and the two noble Grand Masters, who are dressed in their finest peers' robes. The frontispiece is saying, look at the quality and standing of men that Grand Lodge has brought into Freemasonry, who you could be rubbing shoulders with if you joined. It's not surprising that it was retained for the next edition of the Constitutions in 1738, and that it influenced the designers of other Masonic frontispieces. Here are two examples. John Pennell's Constitutions of 1730, seen on the left, was the first Irish edition of Anderson. The engraver has reversed Pine's illustration, which suggests they used it to create their copy. But on closer inspection, it's a vastly inferior work, as is the frontispiece of The Complete Freemason, or Multiporcis for the Lovers of Secrets on the right, which was published in 1764 and engraved by Patrick Larkin. And it borrows Pine's depiction of a noble Grand Master clutching the manuscript constitutions within a classical arcade. We'll meet Larkin later on in this talk. A great deal happened in the 18 years between the last edition of Anderson's Constitutions in 1738 and a new edition by John Scott and the Reverend John Entick in 1756. The Jacobite rebellion took place in Scotland in 1745, with suspicion falling on some Masonic lodges in the north, especially in York. And in London, in 1751, a rival Grand Lodge of England was established by Irish and Scottish Freemasons. Artist Louis Philippe Bottard and engraver Benjamin Cole would need to create a frontispiece that reflected the importance of the original Grand Lodge and firmly place it within respectable English society. Like Pine, Bottard and Cole were both busy Freemason artists. In 1729, Cole published The Ancient Constitutions of the Free and Accepted Masons, which was a pirated edition of the Charges part of Anderson's Constitutions. The second edition featured the frontispiece on the left of modern gentleman masons standing in front of a contemporary building site. From 1742 to 1766, he took over from Pine as the engraver of the official list of lodges, before handing over to his son William. The Coles were an engraving dynasty. Another son, John, would establish a Masonic printing company. Bottard, like Desaguliers, was a Huguenot, French Protestants who'd come to England at the beginning of the century to escape persecution in France. He was also a member of the Anti-Gallican Society, founded in 1745, to oppose a perceived cultural invasion of England by goods and fashions from Catholic France. In the 1738 edition of the Constitutions, which is pictured here, Bottard is thanked for his contribution, which may have been these tail pieces that appeared at the end of each section of the book. In 1746, Bottard illustrated The Sufferings of John Custos for Freemasonry and for his refusing to turn Roman Catholic in the Inquisition in Lisbon, a widely read book which did much to encourage anti-Catholic sentiment in England. That year, he also worked with the Constitution's publisher, John Scott, creating this frontispiece, The Scots Pocket Companion and History of Freemasons. Back to their 1756 Constitutions, their frontispiece is relatively straightforward. A female figure representing Freemasonry sits Britannia-like on her throne, which is decorated with the Grand Lodge's coat of arms. The black and white Masonic pavement is at her feet, on which are strewn a collection of stonemasons' working tools that are used in Masonic rituals. I can see a mallet or maul, a Lewis, compasses, a level, a square, and a plumb line. In the background, a view of London, including St Paul's Cathedral, many of Wren's other churches, and the monument starting point of the Great Fire. A boat-busy Thames flows through London Bridge and out to sea, equally busy with great ships. Ships carrying English goods abroad, just like the Grand Lodge, that was exporting Freemasonry to the world. In the wake of the 1745 Jacobite rebellion in Scotland, this was a very patriotic design. It places the Grand Lodge of England in London, the centre of Whig government and the Hanoverian monarchy. The frontispiece was used twice more, for a new edition in 1767 and for a 1776 reprint. Excuse me. From the late 1720s, prejudice and ritual changes denied London Irish and Scottish Freemasons access to English lodges. So in 1751, they created their own London-based Grand Lodge. Claiming the ritual changes were modern innovations, they called themselves the Ancients Grand Lodge and their rival, the Moderns. Between 1756 and 1813, they would publish 8 editions of their rulebook, which they called a Hemon Raison, or Help to a Brother, for which the 2 original frontispieces were created. They too used their frontispiece to communicate messages about Freemasonry, but they also used them to attack their older competitor. However, the first edition of a Hemon Raison, published in 1756 and compiled by their Grand Secretary Lawrence Dermot, did not have a frontispiece. It also didn't contain a history of the order. Instead, Dermot wrote a very long essay into why it didn't, that actually boiled down to his neighbour's dog eating his only copy. It did contain a much larger collection of bawdy songs, though. The second edition of 1764 featured a title page and a frontispiece by Patrick Larkin, the engraver of the Complete Freemason frontispiece that we saw earlier. The design was by Lawrence Dermot and is explained in his text. At the top is the coat of arms of the Ancients Grand Lodge that Dermot discovered in the writings of a Hebrew scholar, Jacob Judah Leon. He claimed that they were the arms of the Masons who'd built Solomon's Temple. Dermot's Grand Lodge believed it was preserving older Masonic traditions, so they were the true heirs of King Solomon's Masons. The other coat of arms is of the London Company of Masons, a city livery company representing stonemasons, whose arms Dermot accused the rival Modern's Grand Lodge of appropriating without permission, which was true, although he conveniently forgets to mention that he too was appropriating somebody else's arms, even if it's Solomon's Temple's Masons who no longer exist. The arms of the Ancients Grand Lodge featured the animals of the 4 principal tribes of Israel: Judah's lion, Ephraim's ox, Reuben's man, and Dan's eagle, and was supported by cherubim made up of parts of those animals: the face of a man, wings of an eagle, back and mane of a lion, and feet of a calf. The crest was the Ark of the Covenant. These arms were really popular in North America, no doubt helped by Dermot's design. During the American War of Independence, it was widely believed that American lodges associated with the Ancients Grand Lodge or the Grand Lodges of Scotland and Ireland were patriots, whereas members of Modern's lodges tend to be British loyalists. Here, the frontispiece has been copied by the celebrated American engraver Robert Scott for the first American Hemon Raison, published in Philadelphia in 1784. Scott engraved the original die for the Great Seal of the United States and was the chief engraver of the United States Treasury from 1793. The last 6 editions of Hemon Raison shared the same frontispiece, which was initially designed by Dermot for the 3rd edition in 1778 on the left, and revised by Thomas Harper in 1801 for the 5th edition on the right. Irish-born Dermot was Deputy Grand Master when the 3rd edition was published. A wine merchant by trade, he'd originally come to London to work as a theatrical scenery painter, which may be how he knew Michelangelo Rucca, the principal scenery painter of the Haymarket Theatre, who became Dermot's engraver. By 1778, the ancients were an established Grand Lodge with lodges all over England and the American colonies and Canada. Due to their origins, they also had an excellent relationship with the Grand Lodges of Scotland and Ireland. Dermot designed the frontispiece to reflect this, with Freemasonry represented as a temple. Dermot decorated his temple with effigies of the 3 sets of biblical patriarchs, representing the masters of the tabernacle in the wilderness, Solomon's temple, and the Second Temple of Jerusalem, perhaps suggesting that the Freemasons were the descendants of these patriarchs. Masonic aprons featuring the arms of Scotland, England, and Ireland decorate the pillars of the temple, and the names of the Grand Masters of the Grand Lodges of Scotland, Ireland, and the Ancients Grand Lodge are recorded on the pedestal at the base of the central pillar, alluding to the close ties between the 3 Grand Lodges, which was not shared by the rival Modern's Grand Lodge. Pedestals in the temple were decorated with a square, plumb line, level, and compasses, making it clear that the temple represented Freemasonry. Jeweller and Deputy Grand Master Thomas Harper took over the production of a Hemon Raison in 1801, making a very small adjustments to the frontispiece and giving himself the design credit. Can you spot them? I can't see anyone's hands, but it's the coat of arms at the top and the pedestal slightly narrower. The temple design again proved to be popular with American Freemasons and Grand Lodges, which were establishing after the Revolution. This is a 1805 New York edition of the Hemon Raison, which was a reprint of Dermot's 1778 edition. It credits Dermot with the design and retains all the British trappings, including the emblems of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Here are 2 more American versions. The version on the left is from a Maryland edition of the Hemon Raison published in 1817, substituting the names of the 3 Grand Masters with 4 American Freemasons, including the politician DeWitt Clinton and the Masonic author Thomas Smith Webb. DeWitt Clinton had unsuccessfully stood for president in 1812 and was later governor of New York. He was a Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of New York from 1806 to 1819. The temples were popular in American Masonic monitors, which were guides to the symbolism and rituals of Freemasonry, widely published in the 19th century. The image on the right comes from one of these monitors, Cross's True Masonic Chart of 1826, which squeezes in 6 extra patriarchs but leaves the pedestal blank. I guess you can insert your own rulers or patriarchs here. By 1776, the original Grand Lodge, now called the Moderns by everyone except themselves, had opened the first Freemasons' Hall and Tavern on Great Queen Street. Their hall committee took over much of Grand Lodge's administration, including work on a new edition of the Constitutions. The committee appointed the hall's architect, Thomas Sandby, to produce a fitting frontispiece for the book, which was due to be published in 1784. Sandby brought in 3 other artists to help, all associated with the Royal Academy: painter Giovanni Cipriani, and engravers Francesco Bartolozzi and James Fittler. Florentine-born artists Cipriani and Bartolozzi were both members of the Lodge of the 9 Muses, which features in our current exhibition, The Generous Dentist. The lodge, founded by dental pioneer Bartholomew Ruspini, was full of European artists and musicians, including the painter Zoffany and the composer J.C. Bach, representatives of various Italian city-states, and a smattering of English aristocrats. Cipriani presented the lodge with a beautiful set of officers' jewels, which he decorated with classical figures. The master's jewel on the left features the Greek god Apollo. The 2 Italians collaborated on the ticket on the right, created for a series of concerts sponsored by their lodge to be held at Freemasons' Hall in 1783. Like the jewel, the ticket featured Apollo, who was the god of music and poetry. As is often the case with collaborative projects, the production of the frontispiece overran its deadline. Sandby sketched his hall, to which Cipriani added classical figures, and it went to Bartolozzi, notorious for his poor time management, to do the bulk of the engraving. It finally appeared in May 1786, 2 years after the book, with the artists waiving their fees, except for poor old Cipriani, who'd actually died. The frontispiece really captures the splendour of Sandys Hall. The figures on the cloud are Truth and her attendants, Faith holding a chalice and Bible, Hope with an anchor and olive branch, and Charity nursing children. In his description of the frontispiece, which is published in the text, former Grand Secretary James Heseltine described the figures descending as the genius of masonry, carrying a Hall medal for the Grand Master. Truth's light settles on Masonic scientific instruments, perhaps suggesting a connection between Freemasonry and progress. Heseltine must have worked from Cipriano's original drawings, because he too had died a year before Bartolozzi got his act together. The Hall Committee, however, must have been pleased with the results. The Hall looks great, a suitable building for Masonic ceremony or private hire, as it had to be paid for. Selling the frontispiece separately would have also added to their income. Of the 30 copies of the 1784 constitutions in our collection, only 3 are missing the frontispiece, suggesting that the take-up was good. In 1799, the 2 Grand Lodges had cooperated to escape the worst aspects of the Seditious Societies Act introduced in the wake of the French Revolution. This ended 50 years of animosity and led to the birth of the United Grand Lodge of England in 1813, who decided to issue a new book of constitutions as quickly as possible. They planned to release the book in 2 parts, the first containing a new history, which actually never materialised, and the second consisting of the charges and constitutions, but sadly no songs, with a revised edition planned for 3 years later. The first version of Part 2 appeared in 1815, followed by a revision in 1819. Then, in April 1822, Richard William Sylvester of Jerusalem Lodge appeared at Grand Lodge with a frontispiece, printing plate, and a bill for £73.10. It was a surprise to everyone, except for the Grand Master, the Duke of Sussex, who had engaged Sylvester without bothering to tell anyone else about it. The Duke of Sussex was the last Grand Master of the modern Grand Lodge, and the first Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England. Sylvester had come to his attention in 1813, when he designed the ticket on the left for a reception for the Earl of Moira, acting Grand Master of the modern Grand Lodge. He was quickly appointed the United Grand Lodge's official printer. He designed and printed the official Grand Lodge certificate on the right, which is issued to English Freemasons once they've received their 3rd degree, enabling them to visit other lodges. His certificate design is still in use today. His design for the 1815-1819 frontispiece is all about the union of the 2 Grand Lodges. The female figure, representing Freemasonry, holds a fascis or bundle of bound rods, representing strength in unity, and her belt is fastened by a handshake buckle. Her left hand rests on a pedestal, on top of which sits Sir John Soane's Ark of the Masonic Covenant, which was built to house the Articles of Union that created the United Grand Lodge of England. If you come on a tour of Freemasons Hall, you can see a replica of Soane's Ark in the Grand Temple. Behind the female figure is a brazier embossed with the word Concord. The scene is overlooked by a bust of the Prince Regent upon a pedestal engraved His Glorious Majesty. The Prince, a former Grand Master of the Moderns, was the patron of the United Grand Lodge. Sylvester also included plenty of references to Freemasonry and callbacks to previous frontispieces. Faith, Hope and Charity are squeezed into an alcove on the pedestal, on which sits a globe. On the floor is a sphere, which appeared in the 1784 frontispiece, working tools, this time a trowel, compasses and plumb, and a Bible with a large letter G on the cover. Most importantly, he remembered to include the name Duke of Sussex, MWGM, Most Worshipful Grand Master. Don't forget to name check the man in charge, especially if you're going to turn up late with a bill for £73. That's about £6,500 in today's money. The tradition of a frontispiece for the Book of Constitutions ended with Sylvester, The modern Grand Lodge have used their frontispieces to extol the virtues of Freemasonry and the splendour of their new hall. The ancients had used theirs to elevate the importance of their Grand Lodge and to make subtle digs at their rival. Let's say when that's subtle. By the early 19th century, English Freemasonry was firmly established under the leadership of the Duke of Sussex, and there was no longer any need to use such illustrations to reinforce messages of legitimacy, patriotism, or Masonic superiority. After 1819, subsequent versions of the constitutions became little more than a formal rule book, with no legendary history, no actual history, and no songs. Aimed squarely at the members, a frontispiece was now surplus to requirements. If you're interested in learning more about some of the things I mentioned in this talk, please have a look at our website or our YouTube channel. In fact, subscribe to our YouTube channel and you'll be able to find talks about the Duke of Montague, Ruspini of the Lodge of the Nine Muses, and Benjamin Franklin and his reprint of Anderson's Constitutions, which didn't have a frontispiece, but I do mention why it doesn't have a frontispiece in the talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin. Bravo. Amazing talk. If you have a question for Martin, please post it in the chat and we'll do our best to get through as many as possible. Some of you have already started. That's great to see. Martin, thank you so much. Amazing chat, that amazing talk. Martin, I was wondering, before we dive into some of the things you in detail, to some of the things you talked about, can you very quickly, if there are people who might not know, tell us a little bit about how is an engraving actually made? What is the technique behind that?
Yeah, so basically what they do is an artist will draw the design, or artistes will draw designs, more than one of them, and the engraver will copy the design in reverse. And what he does, he engraves like lines into a sheet of metal, and depending on the thickness of the lines, you can do different things like shading, where you might do cross hatches, and then they cover the sheet of metal with ink, and then they clean off all the ink from the sheet, but it stays in the grooves that they've made, the lines that they've made in it, and then they flatten paper onto that, so that makes the print. And you can do it so many times without having to redo the engraving. So once you've made a printer's plate, you can engrave quite a few, do quite a few. Some of the later engravers did different techniques. Bartolozzi, who we mentioned, who was a brilliant, he was really slow, but he was a brilliant engraver. He invented a method called stippling, and he uses lots of tiny dots. And so I don't know if I can show you that on, I've got some pictures. So this is his, this is the frontispiece. Oh, I've gone the wrong way. Let's see if I can get it back again. There we go. And let's see if I can make it bigger. So you might be able to see there's lots, let's go to the figure there. So there's lots of tiny dots. And by making the dots different sizes and putting them closer, can you actually see this? Sorry.
Oh, can you share screen with us?
Sorry, I get all excited and I'm not sharing scripts.
Oh, it's really lovely. It's really lovely. You're explaining this so well.
Let's go back to where I was. Share screen. Here we go. Right. So yeah. So this is Bartolozzi's engraving, and you can see the sort of lines and dots. So by putting them further apart or by making them thicker so they take in more ink, you can do things like light and shade. This is my favourite one of all of them because it's just so much detail. And Bartolozzi is a brilliant engraver. In our exhibition, The Generous Dentist, there's as you come in, there's a coloured engraving by Bartolozzi of a painting by John Stoddart of the girls from Masonic School being led through Freemasons Hall. And the girls' school owns the original painting. And it's rubbish compared to Bartolozzi's engraving. Bartolozzi was a far better engraver than a lot of the artists he engraved for, but he was really slow. I'll stop sharing that.
That's an amazing example there. Thanks, Martin. That was really well explained. That I will go straight to the chat now. There are lots of questions coming in for you. Can you tell us a little more about the esoteric elements on John Pine's frontispiece to the Constitutions and where they may have derived from?
a lot of the stuff was sort of fairly standard things that were used in classical art. So the orders of architecture were well known. So that's basically you use types of pillars to show architecture over time. So the older ones like Tuscan are less complicated. The modern ones are the things like the Corinthian columns are much more detailed and fancy, and that sort of shows progress. Again, they're taking things from classical literature and classical art. So Helios, the sun god, I think he's using things like Apollo as well. It's, you know, people understood symbolism more in those days because a lot of people weren't literate, so things were very pictorial. But educated people, so the aristocracy, the rising middle classes, often had a classical education, so it was things they would have understood. And then some of the stuff is taken from, obviously, from stonemasons' legends. So the old charges, which were these legendary histories of the stonemasons' guilds, which the Freemasons used to help shape their constitutions. There's imagery in there and stuff to do with stonemasonry and building, and then looking back and trying to trace back their ideas to biblical times or even further back. So it's all stuff that was fairly commonly known. There's very little in Freemasonry. It's actually originally invented by Freemasons, but they just used it to symbolize different things.
Very interesting. You didn't necessarily have to be a Freemason to understand the symbolism. It was
no.
Sort of a broader, yeah. That's
no,
really
but in some cases that it might have a different meaning to a Freemason than it would somebody outside of Freemasonry. But the way they were using it on their frontispieces, I think it was aimed at a more general audience because they're trying to still attract members.
That's really interesting. Another one in the chat for you, Martin. Are the emblems in the frontispieces, such as the four figures in the arms of the ancients, recognized as having the same meaning in other books?
I think so, but it depends how many people have read Jacob Judah Leon's. Jacob Judah Leon was a Jewish scholar, and he toured Europe with a model of Solomon's Temple that he'd made or had made, and he gave lectures on it, and he wrote a lot about Solomon's Temple. So I guess people who are interested in Solomon's Temple may have come across those figures before. How much of I've not actually read him, so we have got a copy of one of his books in the collection on the temple, but I've not actually read it. But whether that anyone would come to the same conclusion as Dermot, I don't know, but yes.
Interesting. Martin, you mentioned there towards the end the replica of Soane's Ark of the Masonic Covenant in the Masonic Temple.
Yeah.
That's a replica. What happened to the original?
All right. So so when the two Grand Lodges came together in 1813, they had this big event where they had signed the Articles of Union, and they wanted somewhere to put it in special. And they and John Soane had become involved with Freemasons. He'd started doing some extensions to Sambi's temple, and they sort of he was initiated in the Ancients Grand Lodge, although that was just because it was convenient because they wanted one that was meeting. So he was a Freemason by the time the union happened, and he devised this wooden structure which he designed, and it was built in like a matter of weeks, and the articles were kept in it, and every Grand Lodge the articles were put in supposedly kept in the this Ark of the Masonic Covenant, so it was there so that everyone knew it was safe and they could. But tragically in the 1880s, I think it was 1883, there was a fire in Sambi's temple, and it destroyed all the interior of the temple, including all the paintings and also the Ark of the Covenant, so Soane's Ark. The Articles of Union at the time weren't in it. They were actually in the Grand Secretary's office because he'd been looking at them, so they were spared the fire. But so the Ark was destroyed. And then for the tercentenary of the United Grand Lodge of England in 2017, Grand Lodge commissioned Houghtons of York, who are this really fantastic carpentry firm who do use original, old-fashioned techniques to recreate the Ark. So they went back to Soane's original designs which are actually in the Soane Museum's archives, which are fantastic. So they've got lots of drawings of what the Ark. In fact, there's drawings of different versions of the Ark. So they found the one that they thought was the most likely to be the actual one, and then they built it from these designs. And it was originally on display in the Soane Museum for an exhibition they did on Soane and Freemasonry. And then it was used at the Tercentenary celebration, and then it came to Freemasons Hall. So it's now in the Grand Temple. But sadly, it's sort of tucked away in the corner. I think it should be in the middle of the room, because that's where it would have been originally. And it's a brilliant piece of furniture, and it's really, really fantastic, but it's quite well hidden. So if you come on one of our tours, you have to ask someone to point it out to you.
Yeah, oh, good to know. Good to know. Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Martin. Now, going back to the symbolism just a little bit, because you also mentioned there faith and hope, and did you say charity?
Yeah.
What are they doing on the frontispieces?
Well, they're sort of they're things that the Freemasons are supposed to live their life by. So they're ideals. So it's the sort of, they're part of the sort of makeup of what Freemasonry is about. So obviously, and Masonic charities exist. By the time the 1784 constitutions have come along, Grand Lodge was about, they either had started or about to start their first school, which was the Royal Cumberland School for Girls. And right from early on, I think the first Grand Lodge certificate, which I think is from the 1750s, talks about the contribution to the general charity. And I think, in fact, Pines engraved the rules of of Grand Lodge's charity in about, I think, 1730. So it's always been there, the charitable aspect, and obviously faith, because you've got to have a faith. And yeah, so they're ways of, it's the idol of how Freemasons should live their life.
Amazing. Martin, you mentioned there some of the engravings we have in the museum. We already have quite a few actually on display. And I'm guessing they're also used quite a lot in research at the museum. Where can people go and find more about these?
A lot of the frontispieces, obviously you'll come across them as you look at some of the older books in the collection. We've got a very large print collection, which we're slowly cataloguing. We've mostly catalogued portraits of people, and the cataloguing records for those portraits will have information about who the engraver was and what the portrait is. There have been things written about some of the frontispieces. So this paper was originally a conference paper in fact, it was in 2016 for Cochrane Coronati's celebration for Grand Lodge's tercentenary. You had a year early. So there is a published version of this paper. It's in the conference proceedings from 2013. If someone wants to look at it, sorry, 2016, if someone wants to look at it. There's also various things. If you look on our website, there's another website called Masonic Periodicals Online, and you can search for frontispiece. And these were English Masonic periodicals that were published in the 18th century and the 19th century and the very early 20th century. And there are some articles about frontispieces or engravings in there. There's a really nice little one by Henry Sadler about the Constitution's frontispiece, where he talks about he thinks that it was probably Hogarth or Sir James Thornhill that did Pines engraving, or did design for Pines engraving, although he wasn't credited with it, so it might have been Pine.
Amazing, Martin, thank you. This is fascinating stuff, really, and amazing images you've shown us. Thank you so much. We are running out of time, I'm afraid. A huge thank you to Martin for a great talk, and to Louise for technical support, and of course to all of you for joining us and for your questions tonight. This was our last live webinar in this little spring series. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope to be back with more sometime in the future. Please sign up for our newsletter. Come visit us at the museum in London if you have the opportunity, and also follow us on social media. We would love for you to stay in touch. For now, thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy your evening.